Welcome to this session, Who Will Determine the Future of the Middle East? I'm Jacob Reynolds, Head of Policy for MCC Brussels, as well as Associate Fellow at the Academy of Ideas. Welcome. This is one of those discussions where I didn't have to write down very much beforehand because it's kind of obvious and extremely topical. I don't need to tell you about the fact that even the topicality of this panel is only reinforced by the recent ceasefire deal signed between Israel and Hamas. But really, the purpose of this session, of course, we'll come on to some of the specifics of this, but we wanted to also be able to take a little bit of a step back and analyze the way in which the Middle East has become a kind of fulcrum for a variety of global geopolitical conflicts, and try and analyze it a little bit in detail what's actually driving tensions in the region, not just between Israel and Iran or Israel and in Gaza and all the rest of it, but also talk about some of the variety of other players and the future of the region more broadly. So I don't need to mention the fact that talking about this discussion implicates not just states in the Middle East, the Gulf states, wider players, America, Russia, China, all the rest of it. But so we just want to be able to take, as I say, a step back, ask what's really going on more broadly in the region and who's going to determine the fate of the region. So to help us navigate our way through this, we have a great panel. We've got a large panel as well, so I'll be keeping them their remarks very brief because, of course, we'll want to come out and discuss this with the help of you, the audience. So I'll introduce our panel very briefly. Speaking first will be Dr. Ralph Schoelhammer, who's a commentator and podcaster. He's a professor of international relations, the head of Center for Applied History and IR Theory at MCC Budapest. He's all-round writer, thinker, speaker, broadcaster, podcaster. I like reading him and watching his podcast, so can we give him a warm welcome? Then we'll be hearing from Chris Bayliss, who's over here on my left. Chris will be known to you for emerging pretty quickly as one of the most incisive commentators on global and domestic issues here in the UK, writing for Telegraph, Spectator, other places. He's a great follow on and a critic, and a great follow on Twitter, and delivered a really wonderful lecture event I helped put together over the summer called the Academy, which you can find on YouTube. But Chris, as I say, he's become someone who I read religiously, so I'm delighted to be on the panel with him. Chris, welcome. Then we'll be hearing from Nick Busvine, OBE. He's a consultant, the founding partner of Hermanus Holdings. He's an advisory board member of Briefings for Britain, another place you should always check out and read. He's a former, most pertinently for our conversation today, he's a former diplomat at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So, Nick, warm welcome. And then if you were with us in the previous session in this room, or the previous session in this strand, I should say, on the New World Order, you'll remember Anne-Elisabeth Moutet is a commentator and columnist at The Telegraph, in The Unheard as well, regular on GB News and other places. She spent a few years writing for Proche-Orient, the Near East French publication, and as you'll notice if you followed us in the last panel, always great value in these Battle of Ideas discussions. So welcome. Last and by no means least, we got Dr. Tim Black, who's the books and essays editor at Spite. I was just about to say he's also someone I read religiously, which is true, but it sounds like I've just said that about everyone because I'm trying to be nice to them. But it is actually a sign that I've managed to land myself on a panel of people I'm always reading and thinking about and sharing their articles. So it's actually a sign of how strong a panel we do have. But welcome, Tim. Okay, panel, I'll give you 5 or 6 minutes each for your introductions, and we'll first hear from Ralph.
Thank you very much. I'll try to keep this a little bit shorter than original planned so that everybody also gets a chance to speak. So there is a famous apocryphal quote by Lenin, and Lenin once said that there are decades where nothing happens and then there are weeks where decades happen, and I think we're in such a period. And the problem in such periods is that it is very difficult to distinguish the signal from the noise. And what I mean by this is, if you look back in history, and let's take the time period between 1918 and 1938, in that 20-year time period, you had actually lots of movements in Europe that pointed in the different direction to what ultimately happened. There was rapprochement between Germany and France. There were negotiations between the UK and Germany. So by no means, especially in the 20s, was it clear which course European and world history would take. And I think we have a similar problem nowadays in the Middle East. Now, there are very encouraging signs. I think Jacob alluded to them, the Abraham Accords, the potential, albeit fragile, peace in Gaza. So many things would say, okay, this looks like it's going in the right direction. But you could have said the same in the 1920s in Europe as well, and then at some point it all went horribly wrong. And this is the problem I think we have now. There is no guarantee that the changes we see at the moment will necessarily always move into a more beneficial direction. And there are some signs, I would say, that trouble me at least. Look at Morocco. This is a country I would argue is currently at the brink, maybe not of revolution, but at the brink of significant civil unrest. You have states like Libya, which exist as a place on a map, but not much more. This is not a functioning state. You have states like Egypt, where, if we're completely honest, they're a black box. We don't really know what's going on within those states. Are they standing on feet of clay? Are they standing on feet of steel? To be honest, nobody knows. I mean, this was the great surprise with the Arab Spring now almost 15 years ago, right? It took a couple of triggers, high bread prices, and one vegetable vendor who set himself on fire, and pretty much then the entire Middle East as we knew it burnt down, both metaphorically and literally. We very often hear that the United Arab Emirates are the model for the future. And I think what they've accomplished there is great. But if you take a close look at how they are organized, it's basically, I'm exaggerating for a dramatic effect and to incentivize the discussion, but it's basically a group of sheikhs lording over 80% of the population who are foreign guest workers. Now, that might work in the United Arab Emirates as long as they are rich. If for whatever reason they should stop being rich, this is simply no longer going to work. So this, I think, is not a very important thing. The same with Saudi Arabia. We very often hear about, which is true, about the very reform-oriented MBS, like Mohammed bin Salman, and the very reform-oriented elites. But if you look at the polls that are taken among the general population of Saudi Arabia, a recent one was done by the Jerusalem Post. There's like 2.5 years ago, so the numbers might have changed. But 2 years ago, 90% of Saudi Arabian citizens would not allow an Israeli prime minister to land for a conference in Saudi Arabia. So that's the sentiment among the general population. And I cannot tell you whether this is like the last spike of let's call it radicalism that is now going to wear off, or if this is the actual mood in the region and the elites are trying to gloss over it with the material wealth they are creating. And the last point on this, I think they know that in the region, for a long time, the fear was that economic decline in the Middle East will come because they ran out of oil. Now, the good news is they're never going to run out of oil. The bad news is nobody's going to run out of oil. And what this means is that on the long run, the price is going to decline. If Argentina, if Venezuela, if all these states come online and bring that tremendous resource wealth into the global market, prices will crumble, prices will drop. We saw this with the shale revolution in the United States. And Saudi Arabia and all these other countries in the region will have a massive problem if the price per barrel is not $50, is not $40, if it's $18. And if they get poor, I'm not sure if the United Arab Emirates can maintain their level and their state model. So as I said at the beginning, I cannot tell you what is going to happen, but it's there's a Gramsci quote. Maybe I started with Lenin, I finished with Gramsci, who once said supposedly that we are in a situation where the old order refuses to die and the new order is not yet being born. And in such conditions, the most terrible things can happen. And we don't wish for them to happen, but I'm more sanguine, I guess, than others when it comes to the potential for things going awry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan. Very good. And the model of the brevity will need to get through this discussion and get all the audience in. So next, Chris.
If we'd been having this discussion a decade ago, and I opened by saying that by 2025, Iraq would start to be looking like one of the more stable non-GCC countries in the region, I think people might have questioned whether I'd put in too long a shift propping up the bar. But actually, I don't think it's too outrageous a suggestion. So I'm going to focus on Iraq just because I think it shows patterns that are applicable to the rest of the region, and that things that have happened in Iraq tend to foreshadow what goes on in the rest of the region a couple of years later. So I'll start. The 2003 invasion of Iraq by the US is basically the scene setter for the entire context that we're discussing in the Middle East. And so much of what's happened has flowed from that, and particularly from the catastrophic, momentous decision by Donald Rumsfeld to disband the Iraqi army. shortly after they took over. It set the scene for what, for a couple of years, looked like it was going to be this epoch-defining clash between Sunnis and Shia, and which sort of received opinion in the West basically thought was going to be the model for the future of the region over the next couple of decades. It hasn't quite come to pass, but you had the gap left by the Saddamite state created the space for the IRGC to try and import and extend the 1979 revolution into the Shia heartlands in central Iraq. At the same time as you've got this cataclysmic wave of Sunni radicalism, this supremacist, totalitarian Sunni ideology embodied by bin Laden. And they clashed spectacularly in Iraq, with the Shia ultimately getting the upper hand, and de-Baathification, the disestablishment of the Iraqi army. And you get this officer leadership class completely unmoored, unemployed, unemployable, and disenfranchised, go off to Syria, where they led the basically Al-Qaeda aligned and then ultimately ISIS type organizations that were fighting in Syria. Fast forward a few years, and this metastasizes into ISIS. And the West's response under the hapless leadership of Barack Obama, you end up with this completely path-dependent muddle, as basically the West left the actual grunt work of defeating ISIS to on the fighting on the ground that was done town to town to this basically Iranian-led coalition, soldiered by pretty ordinary middle-class Shia guys in Iraq, that did this fight, at the same time as the West's continuing basically to support the opposition to Assad, which by that time is mainly, not entirely, but mainly people who are on a similar spectrum as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which sets the scene that the defeat of ISIS in Iraq set the scene for a period in which the forces of militancy were controlled and led by almost exclusively by the Shia. The Sunni radicals are militarily but spiritually defeated. They disengage from the fighting, and they actually start to re-engage with the political process in Baghdad at a federal level on a more sort of open-minded term, and they actually start playing this more significant role in the running of the state. And the Sunni areas actually come under, for the first time, this kind of genuine, not progressive, but sort of open-minded leadership. Places like Anbar actually rebuilt quite quickly, to some extent. You're then left with this. Then you start to see it playing out across the rest of the region. Even in Sunni areas like Palestine, the actual forces of militancy kind of look to Tehran to lead for leadership, with in Iran's network of proxies that were left over after the defeat of ISIS. And the Shia-aligned militia groups in Iraq that sort of linger, that were formed to fight ISIS, linger across the country like the Red Army in Eastern Europe in 1945, just there. And their job is to protect, the primary job is to protect Iran's economic, commercial interests in Iraq. And basically Iraq becomes the economic lung through which Iran breathes, financing its operations anywhere where there's a sort of recalcitrant Shia population, be that Lebanon, be that Yemen to some extent. The Houthis aren't quite Shia, but so this is going on through Iraq. The real game changer in 2024 becomes Israel's reaction and the fight after October the 7th. Iran is basically forced to invest its forces and is completely decapitated. The IRGC is massively weakened, and the array of proxy groups are seriously damaged, other than the ones in Iraq that basically sit it out. To some extent, all of these huge organizations, Kataib Hezbollah and Asaib al-Haq, everybody knows that they're there and they're ready and they're enormous. You've got sort of 500,000 men under arms and well-trained, battle-hardened guys, and everybody knows that they can step in Syria or Lebanon or whatever, and they don't. And they sit quietly and wait. Now, sort of fast forward a year, Iran is extremely weakened. You've got this sort of network of Shia militia groups that have now got some independence. They realize that they can actually turn around to the Iranians and say, well, this is now going to be a more equal relationship. This sort of semi-colonial thing that's been going on before. We're gonna readjust that now. And they stayed behind because Iraq was, for the first time, kind of booming. Yeah, 1 second. And there's this construction boom and whatever going on. We've got elections coming up in November, and I think keep a close eye on those because they're going to be critical in terms of what happens in this space that's been vacated by the Iranians.
Great, thank you very much. And a whistle-stop tour through Iraqi politics, which I'm going to have to listen to at half speed when we get back to the end. So we're going to get back to Nick, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, some positive and optimistic things from Chris there. All I can say is that when I was in Baghdad in 2006, 2007, an Iranian proxy blew my car up. So I have a slightly different view. So I did stints in Damascus during the first Gulf War in 91. I was in Baghdad during the height of the second Gulf War in 06, 07. And I did stints on Middle East-related desks in the Foreign Office in the 80s and noughties. So I've been also directly involved in conflict resolution and stabilization operations in places as far apart as Colombia, Mozambique, Northern Ireland, as well as Iraq. I mean, of all these regions, the most intractable, and not to put too fine a point on it, scary, has been the Middle East. Violence defines the region in many ways, and prosperity for those not sitting on vast fossil-based riches depends on achieving a measure of peace and stability. Who determines the future of the Middle East will therefore very much depend on who can actually stabilize the region. Amongst other things, Mike, the company I helped found, acts as the global maritime security advisor to the Lloyd's Market Association. So the Middle East region accounts for the vast majority of the global high-risk reviews areas that we review on a quarterly basis. These include Libya, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Iran, Saudi Arabia, as well as the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, the Persian Gulf, and the Gulf of Oman. In the wider region, we also cover Sudan, Somalia, as well as Eritrea. At the heart of instability in the Middle East lie the twin issues of the Israel-Palestine problem and regional ambitions of Iran that Chris touched on. In my experience, successful peace processes must be well conceived, require enormous levels of commitment by key stakeholders to get over the line. They always take longer than planned to implement, are resource-intensive, and can easily fall apart ex post facto if not actively nurtured and maintained. They also require stick as well as carrot, and ultimately a recognition by both sides that there is more to be achieved at the negotiating table than through the barrel of a gun. We've been around the houses on multiple occasions on the Middle East peace process. Leaders who've taken risks for peace have paid for it with their lives. I'm thinking of Egypt's Anwar Sadat, who was assassinated in 81, and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, assassinated in 95. Yasser Arafat walked away from the 2000 Camp David talks. The Palestinians also refused the Trump deal of the century in 2020. It is unsurprising in these circumstances that the Israelis have increasingly begun to operate under the assumption that the two-state solution as originally conceived is not viable. If all this were not difficult enough, we have all sorts of other drivers, as Chris was alluding to earlier, of instability in the region. We've got internal conflicts, Libya, Syria, Yemen, religious tensions, most notably the Sunni Shia tension, the oppression of minority groups such as the Christians, Kurds, Druze, and so on. And of course, there is the ultimate nightmare that is the nuclear proliferation issue. The coalition that invaded Iraq, and I agree with Chris on this as well, in 2003 massively destabilized the entire region. We sparked a horrendous wave of ethnic cleansing of the most terrifying kind in Iraq. We arguably set the conditions for the creation of Islamic State, and perhaps worst of all, we put a rocket booster under Iran's ability to extend its malign and destabilizing influence across the region. This said, I am moderately optimistic about the future of the region. And this is, I think, little thanks to the UK or the EU, who are now increasingly focused on the manifold problems they've imported from the Middle East region via poorly conceived immigration policies. What gives me hope is the extraordinary action that Israel has taken, not least during the past year, to push back against Iran and its proxies with its action against the Iranian nuclear program, the Houthis, Bashar al-Assad, Hezbollah, and of course Hamas. This on top of a range of other mind-blowing, frankly, operations in recent years, including the acquisition of Iran's entire nuclear archive in 2018, which showed Iranian intent to develop nuclear weapons and effectively put paid to the JCPOA process. Whatever the view of right-thinking liberals about Trump, the 2020 Abraham Accords were historic and the most notable regional diplomatic achievement since 1994, the 1994 Israel-Jordan Agreement. And as I just mentioned, Trump's deal of the century in 2020 was not taken up, and now we have the 20-point plan. Also, we saw in June the US bombing of 3 Iranian nuclear sites. But it is also noteworthy that Trump has not been shy about reining in Israel, e.g. after the airstrike targeting Hamas leaders in Qatar. So who will seize the opportunity to shape the future of the region? I assume the Europeans, Russians and Chinese are likely to be support players. Only the US is playing a central role as an external player. Otherwise, the shaping of the region's future looks set to be dictated by Middle East states such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Egypt, as well as the regional superpower Israel.
Thanks, Nick. Anne-Elisabeth.
I would like to say that the previous presentations have essentially sort of eaten up about half what I was about to say, but absolutely accurate they were too. So my idea was to, one, look at the state of play right now, and two, look at what mostly the West is trying to do in the Middle East, and possibly to ask them, please just stop. It will not be half as harmful as anything you do. And three, and it's been sort of already covered a bit, how do the Israelis think through this? And four, possibly when it is said that China and Russia support players, I would say that, I don't think a country like Iran operates without knowledge of what it's doing in China, and the same thing with Russia. And it is being a player. And what happens in the West is on the one side, where these people are involved are essentially the shaping up of a groundswell of a hysterical anti-Semitic, and I say this having really looked at it, anti-Israel public opinion, because that has an effect on the policies taken by our governments. And we saw this in France, since it was Emmanuel Macron, who was in trouble politically for so many reasons that I won't go into, decided that the one way to get out of this was to declare that France would take a historic initiative and recognize Palestine. Essentially, there's no reason why not to recognize Palestine one day. There was a great deal of work put in 2000 to try and get this happening, involving Yasser Arafat, President Clinton, Madeleine Albright, and as was just said, Arafat walked out of it. But after a horrendous attack on Israel, and in the middle of the war, saying we recognize the state of Palestine that effectively does not exist, you could say Cisjordan, occupied territories, Judea and Samaria, depending on how you feel about it. But essentially, that is barely a state. It's governed by a prime minister who was elected, I think, in 2005 for 4 years, and who's still there, Mahmoud Abbas. He is 88 years old, and it functions like lots of places you leave more or less alone in the Middle East. It is actually not half as unprosperous as people would like to make it out to be. If you go to Ramallah, you will see. If you go to Bethlehem, if you go to all sorts of places, you will see new houses, luxurious shopping malls, restaurants. It's absolutely Judenfrei. It is forbidden to Israelis, but it is a very interesting. I mean, it shows that you just leave them to their own devices. You can argue that political independence would be a good thing too, but as a working community, it is not that bad. Gaza was not that bad either, and the minute it got invaded by the Israelis, the place that had been described by Western commentators as a concentration camp in open air turned out to be a fairly prosperous after all. It now isn't anymore. It's been destroyed mostly by the Israeli army. And that changes also the narrative. But a working state of Palestine that would include those places where Palestinians were autonomous at the very least until the 8th of October 2023, that doesn't exist anymore. So how do we deal with this? one thing, and I have no solutions on this one, is the use of the colonial narrative and the use of extremely weighted, very well used expressions like genocide in the conflict in Gaza have given rise to what you see in London every week. Hundreds of thousands of young people, mostly, but others, and people who have family ties to the region, essentially sort of going through the streets of our cities shouting "Death to the Jews." It has created a specific electorate. It has certainly created a constituency to France's La France Insoumise, France Unbowed, the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. It represents in France something like the whole party is regularly polling between 16, 18, 20%, depending on whether it's a presidential or a legislative election. So it's not a majority. It is openly talking about insurrection because it knows it will not get to either the second round of the presidential election in 27 or to whatever general election is called before that, snap election by Emmanuel Macron. But it has become something important in the decisions of our leaders. And that explains why Emmanuel Macron, who has in his own remit right now foreign policy and defense and nothing but that because he doesn't have a majority in parliament, has decided that he could take an initiative and took the initiative that was then pushed diplomatically to several European nations, and Britain and Spain and others sort of followed. That created actually more than less instability, and which is to say we recognize the state of Palestine. So that is actually a great victory for people who are in the process of losing a war. The war on the ground, whatever you say on the way is being waged, the war on the ground has been won by the Israelis. However, whether they can get something out of this is up to discussion, because they've managed to be called. It's not actually the case in public opinion when you have independent polls, but it is people that the pariahs, and you cannot deal with them. And the intervention, I'll leave the panel to sort of discuss this. The intervention of Donald Trump in this one is like everything else that Donald Trump does. It's surprising, disruptive, brutal, and possibly absolutely clever. We'll see where that goes. But we in the West ought to probably sort of sit back. It's not our conflict. If we import it on our ground, we're not going to like it, and we should leave it to the reigning power, which is mostly America, dealing with other big powers, and to the locals to sort of find a workable solution.
Brilliant. Thanks. I have final introduction before we come out to get some of your questions and comments. Tim.
The blurb did ask us, which power within the region would be able to determine the future of the Middle East. And I would probably sort of just push back against that, because I don't think we can understand the state of the Middle East, either historically or now, without sort of recognizing or sort of paying attention to the geopolitical context in which a lot of the interstate conflict and dynamics have played out. Obviously, just looking at, I would say there are probably three phases. I'd say after the Second World War, you've got the Cold War imperatives tend to dominate. You have, I guess, sort of the regional monarchies tend to be backed by Western powers, regional monarchies at the time, such as Iran, Saudi Arabia. And there tends to be a little bit of Soviet backing, I think, for the Arab secular nationalist states. I think one of the key shifts, I think, happens during the 70s. I think there's a key moment in understanding the kind of the present situation, which is, of course, the defeat of Arab secular nationalism effectively as a result of two ill-fated wars waged against Israel in the late 60s and early 70s. And I say it's a significant shift, and because it does bear on the present day situation, because it's instead in place of, or in lieu of, that kind of secular nationalist politics which was there and present in the Middle East in the 60s. In its place there rises Islamism. Islamism comes to the fore. Islamism is a kind of modern religionized form of politics which develops initially, I think, in Egypt in the 1920s, and it is thoroughly opposed to all forms of kind of Western thinking. It's opposed to liberalism, democracy. It is also at its center, of course, it's deeply anti-Semitic, and all laws, of course, should be drafted not by elected politicians, but of course, ordained by God. And I'll come back to Islamism because I think it does continue to play a significant role, not just in the contemporary Middle East, but of course in the contemporary West as well. Already we've mentioned the kind of, I think after the Cold War, we've got this second phase, which is roughly a period in which the US is the dominant or sort of unipolar sort of power in the world. I think the disastrous interventions in the early noughties have already been covered, and the disastrous consequences, the destabilization in the region, the fact that you effectively seeded, I think, the Islamist militias, which then cut a kind of sort of black-clad swathe in the shape of ISIS through in the mid-noughties through Iraq and Syria. Now, what's interesting, of course, is there's that kind of moment when the US is intervening, and intervening with a degree of confidence, fades pretty rapidly during the noughties. So you have, by the end of the kind of 2000s, the US is effectively withdrawing, and you then got seeding kind of militant Islamism on the one hand, which is cutting a swathe through these massively destabilized areas. I think Jacob's probably saying I've got 1 minute. No. Crikey, that means I could waffle on for a few more minutes. No. Where was I? Massively destabilized region. Arab Spring, by and large, the initial beneficiaries tend to be sort of Islamists, but that's quickly the kibosh is quickly put on that. Obviously, Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood elected 1 year, deposed in a coup d'état in 2013. But I think the key point is that the key beneficiary of the moment in which the US, as the US-led coalition and its power of the region starts to fade, the key beneficiary, as has been mentioned, is Iran. Now, Iran, of course, it is able to take advantage. I think it kind of embeds itself a little bit to an extent in Iraq. I remember sort of reading reports like during the early 2010s, and Qasem Soleimani was often seen as the de facto sort of head of state in Iraq. It might have been a caricature, but I think it's true that Iran embeds itself in Iraq pretty firmly, moves into Syria in the shape of the Houthis. It's intervening quite substantially in Yemen. It continues to build up its own sort of Islamist alliance with its long-standing friends Hezbollah in Lebanon. Of course, intensifies its relationship with Hamas. So my point is that Iran is the main beneficiary of that moment of which kind of US power fades, because it takes advantage of the chaos, it takes advantage of the opportunities to sort of assert its interest. Now, if you'd asked this question, asked the question of what will decide or who will decide the future of the Middle East, I think just over 2 years ago, I'd have said that Iran would have been the key figure, the key power in the region. And I don't mean that in a sense that it would become the regional hegemon. Not at all. I mean that what often happens is that certainly in Middle Eastern politics, I don't think any regional player has the capacity to be the dominant regional power. I don't think Iran has that power. But the point is that Iran actually then generates an alliance effectively against it to thwart its regional ambitions. So you then get the situation where you have states which have very little in common in some ways, in the shape of Israel, Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, who are willing therefore to sign the Abraham Accords, almost to firm up that kind of anti-Iran alliance. So I think my key point in relation to that is that I think the interstate dynamics in the Middle East, because there is no regional power which is capable of imposing itself, because they are simply not powerful enough, or because of historical reasons, because of cultural reasons, because of political reasons. I don't think Turkey does. I don't think Egypt does. I don't think Saudi Arabia does. I don't think Iran does. That what you have constantly is this constant shifting of alliances to thwart any one power that seems to be over-asserting itself. So I think that it's defined by kind of anti-hegemonic dynamic. I think just one final point to return back to, I think, is just the continuing role and significance of Islamism.
You said a sentence and you finished. Very good. We're giving everyone an impossible task because we give them 5 minutes to do the history, the entirety of the Middle East. But now you'll have your chance to have a say, and you'll have even less time. So let's keep it nice and brisk, and we'll try and get through as many people as possible. Right, that microphone, give it to the lady there.
Anne-Elisabeth said that that it should be up to the powers of the region to resolve the conflict. Is that contradicted in any way by the current, what appears to be siding with Israel in terms of the outcome of wanting Israel to win in the conflict as a civilizational question? So I think that's a bit confusing at the moment.
Trump seems to associate himself very much with Qatar. Qatar is associated in many people's minds very much with the Muslim Brotherhood, which must have an agenda. Now it has a big agenda. Is any of the panel worried about any of that?
Yeah, I don't buy this idea at all that Israel is a regional superpower, although it's said very often. And I think people have that impression because of the symbolic importance of Israel and because it's fighting a kind of existential war. So it has to be very ruthless towards its opponents. But if you look at the objective criteria, Israel in many ways is very weak. Your population about 10 million, of whom about 7 million are Jewish, and over 1 million in the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community don't even serve in the army. If you look at the economy, last time I looked, it was about 50th in the world. Admittedly, it has a kind of a high-tech sector, but very small. Land area, about the same size as Wales or New Jersey. Even militarily, contrary to what people keep on saying, Israel is not militarily the strongest power in the region. The strongest power in the region, without any doubt, if you look at the objective criteria, is Turkey. And if there's anything close to a regional hegemon, although I take Tim's point that, there's no clear regional hegemon, it is Turkey, because by all of those criteria, economic, political, demographic, that is the most powerful country in the region. And just finally, if you look at what Israeli security analysts are saying, although they're not saying it very loud, but if you look at what they're saying in their kind of more internal documents, they're very concerned about potential conflict with Turkey, particularly because Erdogan, the president, is becoming more and more anti-Israeli in his rhetoric. So if there's one thing I would take out of this discussion, it's really, I would say, focus more on Turkey if you want to understand the broader picture in relation to the Middle East.
Yeah, mine's a very short point to the panel. What, if any, does the Arab League bring to the party?
The question is, who will control the Middle East? And there seems to be an unspoken assumption that it's going to be some government or the other. And I'm wondering if you might be overlooking something. Specifically, I'm looking at the water crisis in Iran and wondering if maybe climate change is going to have a bigger impact than anything we humans do. Thank you.
Nice question. Okay, let's get some quick responses. Again, with the spirit of keeping it brief, let's just run down the table starting with Ralph.
All right, very quick. I'm going 30 seconds. I'm going to tell you the most boring thing you've ever heard. So please bear with me for a second. So China is the world's largest coal consumption country. They use a process that was developed with the usual German genius, the so-called Fischer-Tropsch process. And what this does is it's a process by which you can turn coal into liquid fuel. If you look at the amount of coal China is using for this process, that would make them, the coal they use would make them the second largest consumer of coal after, China again. And my point that I'm making with this is that currently what props up the Iranian regime, whatever you think of it, right? I'm not making here any political point, is China buying their oil. Once China reaches independence, they no longer care about Iran. So the big problem is, and you will see this all over the region, I think this is also the reason why Trump could get everybody on the table. The big fear in the Arab states, and Turkey, because of its geography, might be a different story. The big fear of the Arab nations is that they become irrelevant. We are still all, as am I, fascinated with the Middle East because this is something historically we have learned over the past, 9/11, the oil embargo in the 70s. So it became like a very, very important part of our lives. But this is fading at the moment because what most Arab countries, again, it's not an indictment of the people, it's just a fact. What they bring to the table is resource richness. But unfortunately, or fortunately for us, the world is very rich in resources. So their dominant role is diminishing. OPEC, it's still nice for them to meet and have fancy dinners, but they don't play the kind of role they played in the past. And you will see this all over the region. So I think this is a very, very important point. So, yeah, that's it, basically.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I really would like to underline how right Ralph is. That's the most important thing is they have less leverage than they used to have. Should the West stay out or go in? The West has got in many times with extremely strange results. So, to the very least, let's look at the means that the West has to go into the Middle East, wherever the conflict is, and it's got to have something that actually Colin Powell theorized, but he was not the first one. Overwhelming force on a specific area, not generalize this, and sort of target and pinpoint. I think there is a case.
Sorry, if I can say, because the sharp edge of the question,
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
was if we're against Western intervention in the region, how do we defend supporting Israel?
If, first of all, Israel is indigenous to the region, but second, if we talk about, for instance, targeting the Houthis are essentially have changed the cost of almost half the world's shipping. They attack Western commercial ships in the Red Sea all the time. There is a perfect, decent case to be made for saying some targeting of the Houthis. Some of it was done by the Israelis, but Western intervention is something that could be understood by the rules of conventional war because they are attacking. And it might sort of encourager les autres. That would be a reason. I don't believe in lots of intervention. We've seen. I was in favor of the Iraq War in 2001 too, and I was wrong. And it's I was not in charge of deciding anything, but you remember how these things first of all start, look like they're working, and then the execution is terrible. And what you mentioned about disbanding the Iraqi army was essential. What the Iraqi army was at the time, it was 1 million people who were supporting their families. It was a part of the social welfare network of Iraq. And when you destroy it, you destroy ties, you destroy structures, and you essentially destroy parts of the economy. So it's very complex. It's very nice to look after the fact and say that shouldn't have been like that. But I'm for limited intervention and letting the locals sort of decide how they want to do it.
Great, very good. Nick?
Yes, well, unlike many civil servants, I tend to define issues in terms of results rather than inputs. And on the point about is Israel a regional superpower or not, I have to say on the basis of results over the last 12 years, I would say they definitely are a regional superpower and are having a disproportionate impact. On Turkey, yeah, I mean, Turkey is a big player. I mean, you might argue about whether Turkey is more European or more Middle Eastern, but they, I think, in a way, their intervention, as far as I understand it, is most directly focused on how to manage their Kurdish issue, which is a major source of instability and will continue to be a source of instability in that part of the Middle East. I think that's it from me.
Yeah, very useful. Chris?
There was a load of stuff about Turkey in the speaking notes that I lost, so I'm very glad that the gentleman in the back brought it up. This moment in which Iran is on the back foot and more absent from various theatres than it was over the last few years, it creates this gap for groups that have been put to one side. So that the Lebanese Sunnis, for example, are one. Elements of the Sunni coalition in Iraq are another, and we're already seeing it playing out in a big way in Syria. There is a gap for a sort of Sunni revanchement, and Turkey is going to be absolutely critical in how that plays out. And the West and the United States has really disregarded the Turkish relationship. Turkey's had a number of serious problems, mainly as a result of catastrophic decisions taken in Washington. And Trump really needs to rebuild that relationship as best he can. I think the thing about Israel, I don't think there's such thing as a regional superpower. A superpower is a global role. Israel is a regional power and a very effective one. But the fact that it doesn't have to think and behave like a global superpower, maintaining that kind of network of interests and whatever, gives it this freedom of action to behave more decisively than a superpower can at sometimes. About the Arab League, I think it would be perfectly possible to write a really comprehensive paper about this situation in the Middle East without mentioning it once. I think that there was a time about 40 or 50 years ago when it was an extremely important forum, and it's just not anymore. There's far too many countries in it for it to be anything more than a bore fest. And I think OPEC's going down the same route as well, to be honest.
Thanks, Chris. Tim?
So I'm going to finish off where my introduction was about. No, I'm not. I think Daniel's right at the back. Israel shouldn't even be considered as a regional hegemon because it doesn't actually have those aspirations. Its simple objective is to survive, to persist, that's what's shaping and determining its actions. And I think that differs from some of the other regional actors who have slightly more aggrandizing approach to the region. Turkey is a key player, is possibly potentially the most powerful of the regional or near regional actors. But it is also considerably hamstrung. The Kurdish issue is key. People sometimes forget, because there's a lot of focus on the Palestine question, but the Kurds are the largest people without a state in the entire world. There's 20 million Kurds spread over 4 nations, spread over Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. And it's a significant question which really doesn't get the attention it should do. Interestingly, of course, Turkey is in the process, it seems, of coming to some kind of rapprochement with the Kurdish Workers' Party, who have, I think they've basically put down their arms. I think people look at me. So
You're
you're
the expert. Come on,
it's happening, right? So the extent to which Turkey can resolve some of its Kurdish problems will perhaps free it up to continue to expand its influence and power in Syria, where it has made considerably inroads, largely through Syria's new semi-ruler, because to be honest, Syria is also still a bit of a patchwork of territories which are under various groups' control, not least, of course, the Syrian Kurds, who control a significant portion of Syria, which they will definitely want to keep. And without wanting to sound too optimistic, I always think Iran is still the key to the region, because of the considerable popular unrest in Iran, certainly over the past, I would say, 5, 6, 7 years. There was, significant strikes and protests amongst working class areas of Iran, which had traditionally been quite, stalwart in their support for the Iranian regime. There was, of course, the women life freedom protests. When was that? About 2 or 3 years ago. So there's significant pushback, I think, in Iranian civil society against an effectively Islamic regime. So I think there is hope there. Although I think at the same time, after the Israel-Iran conflagration, the Iranian regime seems a little bit more empowered. But I do think Iran is the key, not least because that Ayatollah he's not got long left. And the question of succession will open up potentially open up possibilities for a new sort of political settlement in Iran.
Okay, I'll set out that Chris just respond briefly on water, and then
we forgot that really important question about water. Actually, I'd look, rather than Iran on that, I'd look at what Turkey's doing, and Turkey's building all these hydroelectric power stations and doing incredible thing to the Tigris, diverting it and cutting it down, and that's happening with a few other rivers. So it's actually rather than climate change, it's the attempt to address climate change. It's the really big issue, and people building hydroelectric power stations. That's a major factor to look at, even more so than the weather.
Okay, great. Let's have some more questions, comments.
A long time ago, I was an advisor to the Palestinian Authority, and Arafat was still alive. So I may not be completely objective with my understanding, but please don't misunderstand me. I think that asking Arafat whether he would accept a certain treaty or not would be like asking Martin McGuinness for the solution to Northern Ireland. So we knew that after the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement and there was a referendum in Ireland, the overwhelming majority of people in Ireland supported the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that the same would be true in Palestine. Were there to be an opportunity for the Palestinians to have a referendum on a two-state solution. That's my gut feeling, because that was the feeling I got when I lived in Jerusalem and Ramallah 20 years ago. Maybe things have changed. Thank you.
Two questions. You kind of alluded to it, but you haven't really spoken about any of the specifics of it. What form does American influence take in the Middle East at the moment? I mean, directly. So even within Israel, because to me, it seemed like the main reason that Israel got to the point of doing a deal was because they'd more or less destroyed Hamas militarily. So first question there, what forms, kind of concretely, how does American influence manifest itself in the Middle East at the moment? And in relation to, I think it's sort of partly answers that question as well, because if Hamas is still playing a part, then the two-state solution seems like a good way to beat Israel around the head and not much else.
From Israel, I'm going to speak about their God, the all the covenants, the glory, the law, the temple, the Messiah, the apostles, the disciples, everything comes. The whole Judeo-Christian tradition comes from the Jewish people originally. So whether there be a superpower or not, it's not it's up to God. He is the superpower in the area, and he will, his plans will come to pass, and he won't forsake his people.
Well, let's try and figure out what those plans are. Okay, does anyone want to get in? Okay, because I think we're going to ask the panel to address directly the peace deal next. But yeah, you go ahead.
Somebody's already asked this, but what is the end game of Qatar? Why and what's their deal with sponsoring Islamism abroad?
The question was, what's Qatar's end game?
What's the importance of the Western popular movements in relation to the Middle East? What impact do the Western popular movements have in the Middle East in their support for the Palestinian cause? And how destabilizing is that, or how influential is it, or is it not really?
Okay, nice question. There's the gentleman in front of you, then I'll come back to the panel.
As somebody who doesn't know much about it and been very, very well informed today, I can see 4 possible ways that this ends. 1, an overwhelming victory, like World War II. Somebody wins, somebody loses convincingly. The second scenario might be just sheer exhaustion. Everybody is exhausted. The third is an intervention by the equivalent of a British mandate or Ottoman Empire equivalent of the time. And the fourth is a possibility that both sides get a Mandela de Klerk type, where you have a personal chemistry by two extraordinary individuals. None of them seem to be on the cards now, but is there any prospect of any of those 4 coming to fruition?
Okay, good. Let's hear back from the panel. The same order. Ralph, do you want to address some of those?
I mean, one thing that barely gets addressed in this debate is we discuss this very often from our specific angle and from our own lived experience. I guess that's the saying. But if you look at the demographics of Gaza, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the median age or the average age is somewhere between 19 and 21-year-old. They are predominantly male, so there is a male overhang, and I guess everyone in the audience knows this. Hang around with a group of young men in their late teens or early 20s. Those are by default not the most rational people. But that's the majority population in the Palestinian territories, and it's also a phenomenon you have all over the area. And again, that's not an indictment of young men. Good for them that they have them. But my fear is, if the economic model in the region should fail, these people are not going to stay. So from a European perspective, my point is always, what happens if they start to move? What happens if you have a migration wave that is not just sub-Saharan African, but then also North African and Middle Eastern in nature? And again, to be very clear, I'm not making an emotional argument here. I understand if the people want to move. I also would like to live a better life if we ever have the chance. But this is something that will be very difficult for Europe to manage. And it will be primarily a European problem because the Americans are far, far away. So the question about what kind of interventionism, the Americans will intervene when they see it in their interest, and they will walk away when they see that in their interest. There's a famous quote by Bernard Lewis, who died recently, but I think there have not been many British people who know the Middle East as well as he did. And he said the big problem with the United States is they're seen as harmless as an enemy and treacherous as a friend. And I think that is not entirely wrong. But they can afford to do this because, as I said, they have 2 oceans that protect them. Europe doesn't have this luxury. So on the long run, I think the Middle East will be a problem to manage, both from their perspective and our perspective, because, as I said, I think Europe is not going to be able to survive a wave or several additional migration waves as we had in the past. So this is why it will remain relevant. So they need to succeed for us to survive. So that's the best way to look at it.
Okay, several points. I would say to the lady who said God is the superpower that God, by definition, is unknowable, and may he stay that way. In terms of the influence of Western demonstrations and Western activism pro-Palestine, I'd like to. It depends who it affects and how. It certainly, as I said before, it does affect Western politicians because they see constituencies that are going another way, and they see parents who think they want peace at home. It's unglorious, but it's something that is not helping Israeli foreign policy and Israelis' place. Other than that, they just look at it, but they've looked at somebody like Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg, like all of the people of the various flotillas who sailed in the beautiful late summer Mediterranean to sort of go and demonstrate in front of the coast of Israel and Gaza, they see that every single flag, every single scarf, every single badge they're wearing has a map of Palestine, which is the entire state of Israel, and Cisjordan and Gaza. And therefore, what that means is the eradication of Israel. And these young people are not as sophisticated as diplomats, and they usually express that as well. They say Israel is a colonial power, the Jews should be sent back home. Define home is an interesting point, but anyway. So they have disqualified themselves in the view of the Israeli public opinion by and large, and even anti-Netanyahu left-wing opinion in Israel that wants a two-state solution. They don't take this seriously, and they have disqualified themselves at home and as demonstrators in the rest of the world for America, and America is still a superpower. That was one point. And the last thing about Turkey, in Project 2025, which is a kind of blueprint, it's not a real sort of, we have a plan and we're going to follow it, but it's a blueprint that was put together by the Heritage Foundation in the 4 years between when Trump lost the election in 2020 and now. And it's got a whole chapter on creating a Turkic alliance and that would involve places like Turkey, of course, Azerbaijan, and all the way to all the stands in Central Asia. And that is one of the myriad directions that Americans are looking at, people in think tanks, we are trying to sort of organize something that we're not going to make massive requirements about democracy, but we're certainly saying you could be, our place of choice to counteract the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese. You could be building stuff. There's no reason why you couldn't. And there's a complicated diplomatic, economic outreach. And I've no idea how much military, but all the rest that was stressed out in presentations that I've seen. So this might be one way of, I won't say neutralizing Turkey, but it's one way of showing the Turkish government that there's another way of interest of getting something that is good in a country where inflation is terrible, where the economy is not doing very well because people who invest don't like investing in dictatorships, and sort of bringing Turkey back into the way of economic interest and regional interest. I don't know where that's going, but it's something that is very much being worked on, and it would be an interesting way for the future. And I think that is more or less it.
Yeah, that covers it for now. Right, Nick.
Yeah, there was a question about why is the US so heavily engaged? Well, the US and the West generally has been heavily engaged, particularly in the Gulf, because of money, because of oil. And I think there's a sort of a deal that goes on, which is money in return for protection. So traditionally, the Brits provided a degree of sort of military protection. I think Ralph made the point earlier on that whether you're looking at the UAE or Qatar, they haven't really got the wherewithal to defend themselves. So they're quite interested. I think the US's biggest base in the region is in Qatar. So it's about protection. There was another point, and I think also that as Ralph said, when the oil no longer becomes as economically potent as it once was, it'll pose interesting question marks for the region. And the other thing in terms of US engagement, I think Europe is pretty much run out of puff. We just haven't got the money or the wherewithal. Though Europeans are acutely concerned about this and always have been, because the Israel-Palestine problem in particular has a way of manifesting itself. I was on a desk when Pan Am 103 went down, for example. So, we can't ignore it. And I think Trump will expect the Europeans to stick their hands in their pockets to support the 20-point plan, assuming it gets ahead of steam. I think also in terms of the why can't we just get decent people to finally get this problem sorted out? I think people have put in enormous amounts of work over the last 30, 35, 40 years in terms of trying to get both sides to a deal. I can't tell you how much work has gone into it. And at the end of the day, one side or the other walks away. And if you do commit, someone from your own side is pretty likely to kill you. That's a bit of a disincentive, frankly. And finally, as for that lady, I think maybe God is the only answer. So let's keep our fingers crossed.
Chris?
Gentlemen on the front row, your question, the role of the United States, the America's position and its influence in this comes from the fact that it's the only credible actor in the world that can provide an insurance policy that sits behind any agreement like this. The fact that they underwrite it, and they're the only country that can actually deliver consequences and offer some recourse in the case of sort of somebody entering into an agreement like that in bad faith. I think you can see this in the way that Trump approaches a lot of these. The way that he approaches negotiations, you can definitely see it in terms of how he's tried to handle Ukraine, in that he seems to want to demoralize and take the sort of the questions of the rights and wrongs out of the issue, and simply look at either side as parties that have. How do you jig things so that each party has something more to gain by sitting and engaging in negotiations than by continuing on the fight? I think that the approach can be effective, as we've seen. I think that there are definitely limits in terms of, because that's just not how people approach these things. They think in terms of the morality and the rights and wrongs that their side is right. But that's how he tries to go about it. Qatar. I have to say, and I know that I don't trust them at all, and they are definitely trying to spread all sorts of dangerous ideologies. I'm slightly unconvinced that they sort of have the potential to sort of play a terribly spoiling role. I think it surely not beyond the wit of man to box them in institutionally, sort of between the Americans and the rest of the GCC, as we've seen, and I think that they have sort of wound their necks in a little bit since Trump got back into office. And clearly, I think that the role that they have played is sort of somewhere where people from organizations like the Taliban and Hamas can sort of. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you're going to need to talk to somebody who's sort of not in a cave underground with all their communications switched off. And Hamas sort of, Qatar plays a sort of, it's a place where those people can sort of sit in some degree of security, and they're clearly doing so at the behest of the US, and I think in Hamas's case, probably Israel as well.
And they gave Trump a 747. I mean, that must count.
It's pretty useful.
Very good. Tim, and then we'll come back out for just some last comments, and then I'll get the panel to reflect, I think, on the peace deal, as I said.
Yeah, no, it's clearly not beyond the wit of Qatar's neighbours to try to rein it in. It was the blockade in, was it 2020, where basically all land access to Qatar was shut off, power as well. It's not power, but it was significantly isolated. So it already happens. So I wouldn't almost get too hung up on Qatar. I would get hung up on the curious sort of Western support for Palestine, which isn't quite what it seems exactly. I think it's more born of this kind of weird, unholy kind of Islamist progressive alliance, which rests ultimately on this kind of shared loathing of the West, shared loathing and rejection of modernity, and all associated values and principles. And of course, that idea of that kind of idea of modernity they see embodied in Israel, which they loathe with an intensity which I've frankly been grimly astonished by. But that Western support for Palestine, which manifests itself, as Elizabeth said, through basically pressure exerted on politicians who respond likewise by effectively in certainly Britain's case, recognising a Palestinian state, France as well, Canada. It doesn't just manifest itself in terms of that kind of explicit political action. There is now just an intensification of that already existing so-called boycott and divestment, BDS, boycott, divestment, and what was the S? Sanctions. Christ, I've heard it. Sanctions bit, yeah. But now it's intensified. It's not even, it doesn't have to be done under the BDS banner. There is just now, I think, a broad Western cultural political move to isolate and treat Israel as a kind of pariah state. You have Hollywood celebrities who swear not to work with any kind of Israeli kind of actor film production company. You'll see that attempt to kind of make sure that Israel is excluded from sports, Eurovision. It sounds trivial, but it's just all-encompassing attempt to ensure that Israel is treated as a kind of nation and actually seen as like an evil nation apart from other nations. It's treated to a standard that no other nation in the history of the world has ever been treated. And I think that is one of the most worrying aspects of the current situation. And it's worth bearing in mind, therefore, that not only does that drag the West back into Middle Eastern politics, it also drags Middle Eastern politics into the West. And I think that's what we're seeing playing out right now.
Very good. Right. Coming out, last round of questions. Okay.
Just to say like a couple of things about how Israel's being treated. I think we need to remember that Israel was created out of Zionism, and Zionism was created out of anti-Semitism itself. It was more about the Jews need somewhere to live, but that can't be my own backyard. And I feel like Israel has felt that, and the Jews have felt that, and we still treat Israel that way. We don't want them to come over here for whatever reason it was back 100 years ago, and they feel everyone hates us and we don't care. And that's what Netanyahu is positing as his ideals, and that's why he has held support for quite so long.
Very good. Pass that one just in front of you to this lady.
I'd just like to try out a theory. We're talking about the balance of power in the Middle East, and I'm wondering whether there's a possibility of this becoming an irrelevant subject in terms of Islamism and the global crisis of mass migration to the West. And I'm worried that Ayaan Hirsi Ali says that Islam needs a reformation. Christianity had a reformation in the 18th century, which brought in coincided with the Enlightenment, which was about reason and freedom and progress. And I fear that that was the objective conditions then that led to that caused that kind of a reformation. But I'm worried that it seems to me that Islam is a static religion with no sense of time. Judaism and Christianity both include the concept of reinterpreting the scriptures in light of new experiences. But in Islam, the Prophet's words are only there, as I understand it, to be discovered, not interpreted. And good Muslims fit into democracy by going against the teachings of Islam. And I'm worried that Islam is having a reformation now, but it's going in the wrong direction. So please, can somebody disabuse me of this? Because I'm more and more coming to the conclusion that Islamism and Islam are basically the same thing. And when I look at the hatred of Jews, the hatred of Israel, I find it impossible to extricate or to disentangle anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism. I think today they are virtually the same.
Okay.
I'm super interested in thoughts of the rise of influence of Turkey. My family background's like Armenian, and I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel has any thoughts on what happens to like the fringe sort of neighbors such as Armenia in the Caucasus if Turkey does succeed in becoming a more of a power.
A two-state solution has been talked about for the Holy Lands. I think there's and I'm not sure how workable that is with so many settlers. I think about 700,000 living in the West Bank. So another solution, which I'd like the panel to talk about, is the potential of a one state where everyone. So I think a major issue there for many years has been the apartheid system that exists in the Holy Lands. And so if we do away with apartheid and make everybody who regards the Holy Lands as home, which are Jews, Palestinians and Bedouins and other smaller groups, do away with the inequality, we end up with one nation where everybody learns to live at peace with one another. And just another slight point, I'd just like to wonder where Tony Blair fits in. I've been hearing that he's actually behind it. Trump has picked
hopefully
up
nowhere
the plan. Well, I've heard that Tony Blair is the person behind the 20-point plan that Trump has now fronted. That's what I've heard.
Hi, so you briefly touched on the nuclear side of it and nuclear armament. I was wondering if you could turn to that as an area of concern and if that's something that is guaranteeing power to areas like Iran versus Israel, and if that's going to have an area of concern for the subsequent dealings and subsequent stability of the region.
Some critics talk about really the Gazan war in Palestine as a sideshow, and that the forces of Islam and Islamicism duking it out between the Sunnis and the Shias is the real drama that's playing out in the Middle East, and that the West Bank issue, two-state, whatever, is just a sideshow and a cipher for much bigger forces, which does coincide with some of the speakers on the panel. How far do you think that's true?
Okay, very good. Okay, I think it's this gentleman is the last person who wants to speak. I'm going to then return to the panel in the order that they spoke originally. I'm going to give them a little bit more time to, one, answer some question, and then two, touch on what their take is on the peace plan and what the prospects are for peace, at least in Gaza, right? So, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful panel. Following on from the Reformation point, are the panel seeing any movement towards secularization? I mean, there was a comment on the kind of age of the general populace. In most parts of the world, younger people tend to become less religious and more secular. Are you seeing that? And what do you see, if that is true, what impact might that have? Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks for some wonderful contributions. Let's now run over. So, as I say, order in which we spoke, answer a couple of questions, and then the thing that, as I say, somehow hasn't really actually come out, but the question of the peace plan. But Ralph.
Very quick, I start with the last question, which is an excellent one. Yes, it's true that young people tend to be less religious, but it also is true that they tend to be more radical. So if we look at this from a purely religious perspective, I would fully agree. But if we look at particularly Islam also as a political ideological movement, you can also have the opposite effect. And that's, I would say, throughout history, we see this with almost every ideological movement, from fascism to communism to Nazism. Usually it was very appealing to young men. Right, wokeness, I'm not going to go into it, is slightly different. That is, I would argue, more a feminine young female movement, but that's neither here nor there. But young people are not generally, also not young people at universities, are not generally less susceptible to ideologies. I would say they are more so. One last quick point, which I think is the biggest obstacle to peace in the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's a story we don't talk about enough. You can hear from my accent that my mother tongue is German. We don't talk often about the fact that 6 million Germans have been driven out of their ancient lands in 1945. That problem was solved in 1952 for the very reason because there was no international community and there was no United Nations. Nothing against the United Nations, but the Palestinians have been the most wrecked people on planet Earth, not due to their own fault, but because they have been taken care of by some of the worst international organizations possible. They have been frozen in time. They have been frozen in conditions that started in 1948. And let me be very clear, there's a lot that happened was not fair, was unjust, completely agree. But unfortunately, as everybody in this room knows, history is not just and it is not fair. God might be, history unfortunately is not. And this is, I think, the big question for the future. The biggest thing for this peace process to be successful is if we find a way for the people in the region to take their fate into their own hand, but in every respect, because then they have no choice. Then they have to become more rational, right? Because if you're not on the teeth of some international organization, but you have to be responsible for your own economic and social outcome, you just have much less time to be radicalized and follow in the ideological footsteps of the past. But if this is going to happen, remains to be seen.
Thanks, Ralph. Chris.
So just addressing a couple a few people have made about an Islamic Reformation, Sunni Shias, and secularization. I'm going to go back to Iraq again. I think the experience of the 1990s of incredible sanctions that were put on, the extremely cruel sanctions that were imposed on Iraq at that time, and the entire country just sort of turned in on itself, and it led to this wave of religiosity, which then manifested itself in this sort of schism between Sunnis and Shia. I think that for a time looked like it was going to be the defining issue of the era. In Iraq, it really is going away. I think sort of there's more of a sort of rivalry, is sort of intra-Shia rivalry. People are going back to the way it used to be, where you just literally in places like Baghdad, and I think this is to some extent happening in Beirut as well. People are going back to just not knowing whether their neighbors are Sunnis or Shias. So I think that is becoming less of an issue. I think that there's a wave of the wave of religiosity that emerged in the Middle East from the late 70s onwards was driven by young people. I think that my feeling in places like Iraq, I don't know about Syria. To some extent, places like Saudi Arabia, it feels like it's backing off a bit, but I think that that's probably the result of political and economic circumstances, and it could turn on a sixpence. And yeah, the lady above the clock, who I do share the skepticism about an Islamic Reformation. I think it would probably end up looking more like the one that Christianity had in the 16th century than the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And I think that could be jolly bad news for everybody. One last point, I'm going to step in and just defend the comment made by the gentleman up in the gallery, even though I haven't yet fully forgiven him for mistaking me for Graham Linehan yesterday. Come on. I think everybody it got a bit of a laugh. It got a bit of a laugh, but I think that everybody massively underestimates the extent to which Tony Blair is plugged into Trump world. And I genuinely think that he might have more influence over it than any of us would like to think about. So it really wouldn't surprise me to see him popping up and give him a chance.
Okay, let me tell you a story about Tony Blair. In May 2007, Tony Blair decided to get out of Dodge before the global economy blew up and decided he'd pay us a courtesy visit to say goodbye and farewell and thanks for all the fish. And so we lived in a compound that had Bren gun towers and duck and cover shelters and radar alerts when rockets and mortars came in. And the day before Tony Blair was due to arrive, there was... I got a call from the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq. I went round and he was on a jogging machine, slightly sweaty. And he said, "I'm terribly sorry to have to tell you that the president has let slip to the Iranians that your prime minister is coming tomorrow." So I duly reported this to the powers that be. And I was reassured that Tony Blair would be coming the following day. And at exactly 10:30 the following day, when we were all standing with cups of tea and cucumber sandwiches, poised for the arrival of Tony Blair's helicopter, there was an almighty explosion in the compound of the embassy. And as I said earlier on, not one but two of my cars got blown up, and they were armoured vehicles as well. So to be fair to Tony Blair, he did turn up, and I think it was probably about 3 hours later, and it was probably a reminder to him of kind of what he'd unleashed on the rest of us. Whether he is the right pick to run the Palestine Oversight Board, I'm not so sure. Just to address a couple of the points that have been raised, I mean, on the kind of idea of do we now go for a kind of a one-state solution? I mean, I think it's a very good question, because the logical conclusion of the Israeli position right now is that there can't be a two-state solution, so there has to be a one-state solution according to their logic. How that will work, I have no idea. I mean, what I would say about Israel is I find it deeply disturbing, to be honest, the degree of sort of hatred, because as far as I can see, Israel is the only genuine democracy in the Middle East. There are some pretty wacky parties there who are distorting the way that Israeli policy is operating on the ground, and there are some things that Israel does which are frankly really unpleasant. But the fact of the matter is that they are a democracy, and I think if organizations who shoot their rivals in the streets and execute their rivals in the streets are, frankly, the model for us to follow, given the rather unfortunate habit of this issue extending itself onto our streets, that I think is really rather a grim prospect for all of us. So I hope that. So I'll stop there.
Very good, Jen. Very good. So it's Anne. Thank you, Anne-Elisabeth, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Several things, but I would like first to answer the gentleman who talked about apartheid with such conviction. And I would like to know if this gentleman has been to South Africa under apartheid and has been to Israel, because there are a few differences in housing, in jobs, in access to practically anything. You have ministers who are Druze and Arab, and I'm not sure there's a Bedouin, but you have Bedouin generals. You have lots of Druze generals. You've got people not only of Arab, Christian, or Muslim descent winning various Israeli pop television contests, but even Filipino immigrants. And it is about the least apartheidy country I've seen in my life. You have beaches. You have beaches in Israel where you've got the card of the mosaic of ways to dress, which has become illegal in France, my own country. So by and large, no, I don't think it's an apartheid country. I have met lots of Arabs who have decided that, yes, this is a flawed country. They disagree with it. They're members of the Knesset, and still they like the fact that they have a working democracy. And their sort of eagerness to be assassinated means that they do not always say it as loudly as they do publicly, but they still believe it. And you just go to the Knesset and see how they deal with their Israeli colleagues. And no, this is not apartheid. They have the jobs, they have everything. And I'm very surprised that you have been buying into this. But that is part of using the word apartheid or genocide, because you've got to tar Israel with the kind of sins that have been committed against people in the name of racism and against, indeed, Jews in the name of anti-Semitism, which is racism. I think you asked a very good question about the whole Turkic sort of outreach, Turkic countries, and you quite rightly named the problems with the Azeris and the Armenians, because the things that were perpetrated on the 7th of October in Israel were also perpetrated by the Azeri military on the Armenians when they took back Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm not going to go into the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, but unfortunately, these things are now being videoed. So I've seen videos, and honestly, there's not much to differentiate one from the other. There were no babies, but that's about all I can say. So it is a problem. It is also known that because, for various reasons, and mostly that there's a 20% minority of Azeris in the north of Iran. The Israelis have been extremely reluctant to express themselves about this, because they held the Azeris in northern Iran on the old Middle Eastern thing that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, at least for the moment. I don't know how that goes. It probably is something that can be worked out. I'm not going to recommend the Israeli regime to many people for various reasons. That one, especially, honestly, the videos were sickening. But it is something that, unlike other issues in the Middle East, probably can be discussed over time in a more civilized manner than the grandstanding, sort of buttressed by Westerners who don't know much in the streets of our various countries in the region. I don't know how far it will go. I don't know whether it can be achieved. And that's my answer on it. That's about it.
Great. Thank you very much, Anne-Elisabeth. Tim.
I think after the inevitable nuclear war, which is surely coming, probably starting in the Middle East, I think the only thing that would be left or survive and will be cockroaches and Tony Blair. I think the man really is the political turd that won't flush, just floating around geopolitics. They're great unflushable. I think it's probably worth trying to allay some fears about Islam as a kind of broad religion followed by, 2.5 billion people. The largest Muslim majority countries, of course, in Southeast Asia. There are problems. I think there are problems in Malaysia, of course, at the moment. But you can see that it doesn't necessarily. You don't necessarily have to have a Muslim majority country, which is automatically tending towards kind of oppressive authoritarianism. And so I do think it's pretty worth bearing that in mind. Having said all that, I do think Islamism is a problem, we do need to distinguish it to an extent from Islam. Of course, it derives from it to an extent, but it's also a very modern ideology. It's an ideology which emerges, as I said, in 1928, I think, in Egypt, and it emerges partially under the influence of anti-Western or deeply reactionary thinkers from the West and in the West. And some of their thoughts are taken up by Egyptian Muslim ideologues, which then creates the Muslim, who then found the Muslim Brotherhood. But I think the key thing to understand that it is as an ideology, it's fueled by its opposition to Western modernity. It emerges in the 20th century in opposition to Western modernity, and that's what gives it its force and continues to give its force. And actually, it means that when you get this turn against Western modernity on the progressive left, probably from about the 60s, 1970s onwards, you then get like an unholy dovetailing of these two ways of thinking, and a dovetailing of, on the one hand, an anti-Western Islamism, and on the other hand, an anti-Western progressivism. And unfortunately, as other forms of radicalism have mutated in the West, as they have moved away from traditional kind of working class politics, what you've had, I think, over the past 2 or 3 decades, I know the French sociologist or sociologist of religion, Olivier Roy, makes this point. What you have is the Islamization of radicalization in the West, right? So the radical opposition to sort of the status quo in the West increasingly takes this kind of oddly sort of Islamist form. And we've seen that amongst kind of young jihadis who aren't particularly devout Muslims themselves. But what appeals to them is that kind of Islamist rejection of the Western way of life. So I think that's a massively important thing to bear in mind. It's a massively important thing to bear in mind because I think as much as there is a conflict being waged right now in the Middle East, I think the real conflict that we have to fight is at home here. I think there's a real culture war that we have to fight against the kind of deeply reactionary anti-Western strains of thought which have gained preeminence over the past 2 years.